So thank you so much. It is really a treat to be here, not only because I was here when it was about 25 employees. Well, it actually wasn't here, but it is just amazing to walk around and see what this place has become. I was around when the venture capitalists who invested in Google had a big press conference and announced what they had done, and everybody was saying, what a stupid investment. Search is dead. And come back today and see it like this is pretty incredible. The other reason why I'm excited to be here is because, as I hope you will hear and understand, Pyotr Smirnov, who is the person who started Smirnov Vodka, was an exceptional entrepreneur. And in fact, if he were here today, he would be somebody who might be working alongside of you at Google. It's really just an amazing story. And one I'm constantly asked how I got on it and why I did it. And for those people who actually know me, it's a terrific question because most of the research for this particular book was done in 19th and early 20th century Russian archives in Russia. Well, obviously, I live in Silicon Valley, and I do not speak a word of Russian, nor do I read it. So that was a bit of a problem for me. The second thing is the story kind of follows the history of Russia itself in 19th and early 20th century Russia, from the Crimean War to emancipation to industrialization to the revolution and the fall of the czars. And prior to this book, I had studied nothing in Russian history, so I also had a steep learning curve there. And thirdly, as you see, the King of Vodka is about a vodka maker. And I am not a big drinker, so I had a series of hurdles in going for this book, but the reason why I did it is truly it is an exceptional story, particularly when you understand the political and economic situation in Russia at the time, and Smirnov himself. He was born in 1831 in a small village, and he was a serf. So he had a master, somebody who owned him and his family. He was the absolute lowest of the lows in Russian society. He was completely uneducated. He had absolutely no connections. And yet, from that start, he managed to become one of the wealthiest, most successful capitalists in all of Russia. By the time he died at the end of the 19th century, 1898, he literally was one of the richest men in Russia. So it's kind of an amazing story just from the outset. And you think to yourself, how could that be? And I thought to myself, how could that be? And kind of really wanted to find out about it. But I didn't quite know how to write the story for a variety of reasons until I read Seabiscuit. I don't know how many of you have read that, but most people know the story about the underdog horse who comes from nothing to win it all. And it's a great drama. It's a great story in and of itself, which the Smirnov family story is as well. But what really made the book work for me was also it was surrounded by this wonderful historical detail. I mean, you learn about the lives of jockeys and the history of horse gambling and all kinds of things that happened. And when I read that book, it was like a light went off in my head and I knew what I wanted to do. So after that, I kind of started to look into the story a little bit more and just became hooked. Now, as Pepe mentioned, I got started, I was the legal affairs editor of Business Week. And in 1996, a man came to see me. And he was a representative of a number of Smirnov's descendants. And at the time, they were suing the company that owned the Smirnov brand to try to get their trademarks and copyrights back. So with him, he brought this long white scroll, and he unrolled it on a conference room table, and it turned out to be a Smirnov family tree going back to the 1700s. And he began to tell me the story, a little bit of the family, and how they felt like the brand had been illegally taken from them after the Russian Revolution, and they felt it was really rightfully theirs. So I wrote about it for Business Week, and I kind of just kept that in my head. What I'd like to do is read a very short passage from the book for you so you can get a sense not only of the history and the taste and the smell of Russia at the time, but also of kind of the remarkable nature of this man. So it's very brief. The smell of mud and wet stone hung in the air. Moscow had been in the midst of an unusually warm spell. It was already late November, yet dandelions and daisies were poking out of the earth, nurtured by a steady, balmy drizzle. The few flakes of snow that had fallen had quickly vanished, leaving cobblestones glistening on the ground. As the spring-like days wore on, it seemed like winter might never come. But it did finally. As December 1898 arrived, a chill snuck up on Moscow like an invading army. Snow began to fall before daybreak and continued without interruption. Soon, a thick coat of white buried the city. Sledges, large wooden carriages that glided around town on metal runners, took the place of clumsier wheel vehicles. Within a day, temperatures dropped another 15 degrees, leaving Russia's then second largest city in its more typical seasonal state, gray and frigid. Little else, however, was typical that December day, particularly at the corner of Pyotr Street, just past the cast iron bridge, a pathway that led directly to Red Square and the Kremlin. Since 8 a.m., crowds had flowed into this neighborhood, known as a hub for Moscow's flourishing merchant class. Wealthy businessmen arrived with their elegant wives. Important government officials and religious leaders left behind other pressing matters to make an appearance. Workers and peasants showed up in droves, spilling out into the street leading to St. John the Baptist Church. The crush was so dense that movement became almost impossible. Horse-drawn trams that usually seesawed through the center of Pyotr were forced to stop running as long lines of mourning carriages surrounded the block. At 9 a.m., the bell rang out, snapping the masses to attention. All eyes turned toward a majestic funeral chariot, outfitted with a canopy of rich silver brocade. It was parked before the grandest residence on the block, a 3-story high mansion that was a testament to the architectural beauty cropping up all over Russia. The heavy wooden doors parted, and the archdeacon from St. John the Baptist Church emerged, softly reciting prayers. A group carrying a coffin cover decorated with a wreath made of natural flowers fell into line after him. A choir came out then, singing the Holy God prayer, followed by a dozen workers. Each carried a pillow with sacred medals and honors earned by the deceased during an extraordinary life. At last, a coffin emerged, draped in sumptuous fabric made of golden brocade and raspberry velvet. It was the second day of December, and this elegant tribute was not for a czar or a high-ranking minister or a military chief. The man inside the long oak box was Pyotr Smirnov, arguably the most famous vodka maker in the world. I don't know about you, but when I started reading the coverage of Smirnov's death in Russia and saw the tribute, it was like he was a national treasure. I was completely sucked in. And the feel for that era and the feel of this man and who he was really something that I spent 4.5 years trying to pursue and figure out. And one of the things, as I said earlier, Smirnov was an extraordinary entrepreneur, a genius when it came to marketing. One of the things that made him that way was actually that he started as a serf, and he was a peasant, and he understood his customers. Vodka was a ubiquitous product in Russia, literally thousands of vodka makers. Every village, rural and otherwise, had somebody designated to make vodka for the people who lived there. So for Smirnov to emerge out of this group, he had to really do something pretty extraordinary. And he actually did. He did something very brilliant. One day, when he was just starting out, he went to this place in Moscow called the Kitrov Market, which one journalist at the time called a moving rotten mass. And he went there to find day laborers who would come to get work. I mean, this was just a smelly, horrible place. They served rotten food that the women kept warm by sitting on their pots. I mean, it was just really, really an awful place. But he managed to find 15 men. And he brought the 15 men back to his vodka factory, and he sat them down, and he gave them good food, and he fed them vodka. And then he slapped 3 rubles down in front of each man. And he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to fan out throughout Moscow, and I want you to go to the pubs. And when you go to the pubs, I want you to demand Smirnoff vodka. And when the waiter looks at you and says, I've never heard of Smirnoff vodka, I've got other vodkas, what's the problem? I want you to make a scene. And I want everybody in the pub to hear you. And I want you to get the manager out there. And then I want you to say to him, how could you possibly not have Smirnov vodka? This is the greatest vodka in the world. Everyone's going to be drinking it. You're crazy. And I want you to leave in a huff and go to the next bar and repeat the scene again. So these men did that, the story goes, and within literally days, orders for Smirnov vodka were pouring in. And it was because he understood. I mean, these people in Russia at the time, they were virtually all illiterate. They didn't know about brands. There were no brand protections in Russia until the end of the century. And the only thing that they really cared about was, you know, did Vladimir at the end of the bar say this was a good vodka? And he knew that. So the men came back to his factory, and he then said, okay, we've got Moscow now. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go on the trains, and I want you to get off at every stop, and I want you to repeat this again. Go into the bars, tell them you have to have Smirnov vodka, and then come back to me. And these men did it, and within a very short period of time, a shockingly short period of time, even for Silicon Valley, Smirnov was among the top producers of vodka in all of Russia. It's a pretty amazing story. I mean, he was one of the original viral marketers. So that was how he got started among the masses. But Smirnov was also somebody, and not unlike many people, he really admired the aristocracy. And he really wanted to be accepted by the aristocracy. And his bloodlines made that a little bit difficult. So he had to have a different strategy to get accepted by them. And what he did was also extraordinary. First he began entering international competitions. So he went to Vienna and Paris, and he sent his liquors to Chicago and Philadelphia to the World's Fairs, and he started getting honors and awards. And one of the things Russians loved at the time was, you know, admiration from Western Europe. That was just an amazing thing. If they said you were good, you must be good. So he racked up all these awards. But also what he did, in Russia at the time, merchants were really looked down upon. There was a sense that you could not be successful in business, you could not be successful as a merchant unless you were corrupt, unless you did something and ripped off everybody else. So Smirnov had to do something to make people think that he wasn't a rotten guy. And like other merchants at the time, he decided to become a philanthropist. He was very selective in the charities that he chose to support. They had to be charities that the Tsar, either the Tsar endorsed or was familiar with, or that had been begun by nobility and aristocrats. So he gave a lot of money away doing that sort of thing so that people would think it was kind of a way of paying for all of your wealth and your luxurious lifestyle. He also gave money to the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, which was very important in Russia at the time, and he was a very active member of the church, you know, did all kinds of things to contribute to their success. So by 1886, he'd actually tried to be the purveyor to the Tsar when he first got started. That's how ambitious he was, and he got immediately rejected. But by 1886, he had a lot of accolades. He was a philanthropist, and he was really somebody who the Tsar could then embrace, and he became purveyor to the Tsar. Now, becoming the purveyor to the Tsar was a big deal, very big deal. I mean, Steinway was the piano provider. Singer provided sewing machines. There was actually even a royal leech man. So if you could say you were the guy the Tsar used for whatever it was a very big deal, and it led to, obviously, increased sales and lots of money, and Smirnov did that. What was also interesting, and this is not so different from today, is his success was so extraordinary that he kind of became a lightning rod for the debate on alcohol in Russia. At the time, and they still grapple with this today, alcoholism was a big problem. There were a lot of rogue vodka producers, and Smirnov, being so prominent, became somebody who was attacked. And Chekhov, who we all know is a great playwright, he was also somebody, he was a sobriety crusader, and he wrote about Smirnov and other vodka makers as peddlers of Satan's blood. So first he had Chekhov after him, and then interestingly, Tolstoy. I never knew this, and one of the great things about writing this book is that it let me study things above and beyond sort of the business culture and merchant culture. I got to learn things about Chekhov and Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky and the czars, and it was so fascinating. But Tolstoy actually was one of Russia's leading temperance advocates. And one of the things that he did, and he was very outspoken, he wrote about it, but he also did things on the local level. One day he called the villagers in his village together, and he had a document there for every man in the village to sign. And it basically said, I'm going to stop drinking, I'm going to stop smoking, I'm going to give up my vices. So he made everybody sign this. And then they had to bring their flasks, and they had to throw them into a ditch that had been dug into the ground. And they had to throw in their tobacco and anything else that they had, and they buried it. And this was sort of his symbolic way of telling people that, because Tolstoy believed that if you drank, you did things that you would not ordinarily do because it dulled your conscience. And he was not obviously successful. Everybody knows what happened in Russia, and that alcoholism continued to rage. But had he been successful, I mean, he actually designed what would have been the first warning label on alcohol. It never got approved by the Duma in Russia at the time, but he was pretty out front on this issue. So because the problem of alcoholism became so bad, the government towards the end of the 19th century decided that it needed to take control of the industry. Of course, it didn't hurt that if it monopolized vodka, the government stood to make millions and millions and millions of dollars. But that's what it did. They took over vodka production, which really hurt Smirnov's business. It would have survived had it not been, in some form, it would have survived had it not been for his son, had it not been for the Russian Revolution. And his sons had taken over the business, but most of them were not particularly interested in the business. One of them was, but he died in 1910, and the others, they were interesting characters. They liked to gamble. They liked their women. One of his sons was an alcoholic. Very, very interesting. Makes for good reading, I should say. But ultimately, the revolution did hit, and one of Smirnov's sons, Vladimir, was actually put in a Bolshevik prison. And he has memoirs left that his wife recorded, so we actually know what happened to him. And he was sentenced to death by firing squad. He was actually dragged from his cell 5 different times, put up against a wall at the prison, and with the guards in front of him with their rifles, and he would say, ready, aim, and then they would break out into uproarious laughter and take him back to his cell and do it again the next day. So it was psychological torture, not uncommon at the time. But fortunately for Vladimir, his prison was liberated by the Cossacks. So he was able to flee Russia and went to Western Europe, ultimately to revive the brand. Was not particularly successful doing it, but I would say Vladimir is the reason why we have Smirnov vodka today. He sold the licenses to the brand name to a Russian emigre who was living in the United States at the time. And in 1934, he started making Smirnov vodka in the United States. It was the first vodka that was produced here. And it was a complete flop, truly. They could not get sales going. The United States was kind of a beer-drinking, whiskey-loving nation. And eventually, that Russian emigre, who's named Rudolf Kunet, had to sell the license to a company known as Hubline, which was best known then for A1 steak sauce in Connecticut. And the reason why we are having Moscow Mules today is because Hubline then came up with a very Smirnoff-like plan to get people interested in vodka. And what happened was the CEO of the company at the time, who was named John Martin, had a friend who owned the Cock and Bull in LA, which was a pub and restaurant watering hole that a lot of Hollywood stars used to go to. And these two men got together, the story goes, and they created the Moscow Mule, which is the cocktail that you are tasting here today. And what they did was they combined the Smirnoff vodka with the ginger beer. And John Martin, they say, brought one of the first Polaroid cameras out and went to the bars, took 2 pictures of the bartender making the Moscow Mule, gave one to the bartender, and kept one for himself. He would then go to the next bar and show that bartender hey, look what your competition is making. Moscow Mules, this is the coolest cocktail out there now. And he kind of, through grassroots marketing again, got people interested in vodka, and Smirnoff vodka ended up really taking off. And it's an amazing success story, actually. Smirnoff vodka is still today, I mean, Smirnoff died in 1898, born in 1831, and today Smirnoff is the best-selling spirit in the world. It is the most valuable spirits brand in the world. The last check, I think, was almost a $5 billion brand. And it's James Bond's vodka of choice. It's been in all but one of the Bond movies. And it continues, even in this economy that we're here in, excuse me, that we're in now. Smirnoff vodka continues to flourish. So that's what the book is about, and I hope you enjoy it. And I had, oh, am I down? Okay. I was just going to show you a couple of pictures of some of the family and the places where they lived, just so you could see, but we'll see if this works. Uh-oh. Well, I'll get that up, and then I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Oh, is it up now? Okay, good. So this is Smirnoff, and this was actually the photo that they used to commemorate his death, so it was in the Moscow newspapers when he died. And this is his wife, lovely Maria, who he married when she was 16 and he was in his 40s, but she died 4 months after he did, in a very unexpected way. This is actually the house by the cast iron bridge. This is where Smirnoff both lived and had his factory. So you can see on the sides, he actually, and this has been largely renovated so that it looks much like it did. If you go to Moscow, you can actually go visit it. And it says Purveyor of the Tsar on the side of the house on both sides. And it's really an extraordinarily beautiful building. And this is the street it's on. So that's Smirnoff's house on the left side first. And this is how the street looked. And that's the church that he was buried in. This is his son, Pyotr, who was his eldest son and the one who actually took over the business after his father's death. Probably the most business savvy of the group. And that's his wife. This is his other son, Nikolai, who enjoyed drinking way more than he enjoyed business. Also, he was into breeding horses. Nice little aristocratic pastime. And this is Vladimir, the one who spent time in the Bolshevik prison and ultimately was responsible for the brand surviving, one of the only pre-Bolshevik brands that has survived. And that is his wife and son, Vladimir's wife and son. This is the son, his name is Sergei. He's one of the interesting ones. He actually broke with the family and did something completely scandalous. He put about $1 million into a revolutionary or liberal-leaning newspaper that was run by a Jew, and that was really, really bad at the time. So he was a complete renegade. A really interesting guy, actually. And this is the last son, Alexei, and his wife. And this is one of the daughters, who was kind of a wild thing. The picture of family members and friends. This was at one of the fairs, actually, in Russia, and Smirnoff just received all kinds of kudos. These were flashing, these were bottles with lights inside of them, and they flashed and lit up the colors of Russia, national colors of Russia, and the flag. So that was kind of a popular thing. This is the factory closing day when the vodka monopoly came into being. And these are soldiers who were kept at some of Smirnoff's dachas. They had been injured, and they turned their dachas into hospitals. And that is the last Tsar of Russia on a boat being greeted with a cup of vodka. That's one of the son's lovers. And this last picture is of Vladimir and his third wife after he had fled Russia, living in France, and they were so poor they actually started, they put on these boyar costumes and they were singing for money. So there's after the revolution, the Smirnovs, like so many other wealthy individuals in Russia, sort of suffered greatly. So there you have it. Happy to take questions if you have them.
Thank you for coming. What happened with the lawsuit?
Actually, in 2006, the lawsuit was settled, and Diageo, which is the name of the company that owns the Smirnoff brand, agreed to pay a company that had rights to the Smirnoff name in Russia. So now Diageo can distribute Smirnoff and all of its other liquor brands in Russia as a result of that settlement. But still, there aren't any Smirnoffs involved in the company or in the vodka brand at all.
So at Google, we're always talking about how we can scale and grow as a company as we're maturing. And so I kind of wonder if there are any lessons about how to be like Smirnoff and build a really strong brand from their story. I mean, it seems like they've had to survive a cultural revolution, which we have not, guess, yet had to do. So I don't know if there's any kind of, leadership or brand or business lessons to be learned from this history.
Well, I think the greatest success here was really that Smirnoff knew his customers and catered to his customers, and that's how he built his brand. And he sort of segmented the people that he was trying to reach, whether it was the peasants or the aristocracy or people in the middle. And I think that's been carried on through the years, and there was a real sense. I mean, the man who ended up licensing the brand in the United States was not particularly successful on his own, but once he sold the brand again to Hubeline at the time, I think they sort of repeated the sense that you know your customer, and if you know your customer, there's a million different options of things that you can do, and they've kind of continued that tradition. Truly, I think it's amazing that Smirnoff continues to be so successful. And the other thing is, for me, Smirnoff himself never let his circumstances, the disadvantages of who he was and where he came from, get in his way. And there's just always a way. I mean, you go back to the story of Google and people talking about search is dead. It's over. The race has been won. Why is anybody interested in this other company? Well, of course, somebody figures out how to do it another way, a better way, whatever it is. The game is never over. And I think Smirnoff was really a good example of that.
How has the production of Smirnoff vodka changed over time? Like, if we tasted what they made 100 years ago, would we recognize it?
Well, interestingly, they say they use the same recipes. It's obviously not the same water, it's not the same grain, but when Vladimir fled Russia, he apparently had some 300 recipes from his father with him, on him, in his brain or something, and they say that they have used those. And some of the flavored vodkas, I mean, Smirnoff was actually, he would have done well today. He was very much into fresh local produce, so he used to have produce brought in from the countryside, and they would cart it to his factory, and it was a mess. I mean, you can only imagine there were these just caravans of carts with fresh fruits and herbs and things that would be brought in, but he insisted everything had to be fresh when he infused his vodkas. So some of the vodkas from that era, some of the flavored vodkas from that era are still made today, and number 21, which is the one we have here today, right? Was the most popular vodka in Russia during Smirnoff's time, and I believe it is the best-selling vodka in the Smirnoff repertoire today.
So you say you don't speak Russian and you're not a big drinker. So how did you find this story? How did it come to you?
Well, I got on it from the story I wrote for Business Week, but what really made it work for me is when I took my first trip to Russia, which was in 2005. I packed up my kids and my husband, and we went for the summer. I found an extraordinary woman who was a full-time translator and researcher for me throughout the project. So I knew what I wanted to do with the book. I knew what I wanted to do with the story, but she was able to do a lot of the research for me. And I found, actually, hugely, hugely helpful to have a local doing a lot of the legwork, because when I was there, the fact that I was American was not a plus, as you can perhaps imagine. I went to see some of Smirnov's descendants when I was in Moscow, and no matter how hard I tried to explain that I was an independent journalist pursuing a story that I thought was fascinating, at the time the litigation was going on, and I could not dissuade them from the idea that I had been hired by Diageo or was somehow working with Diageo to write the story to help them win the lawsuit or something else. So that was problematic. And also, some of my experiences in the archives made me realize that it was much better for a native to be doing the research than for somebody like me, because the language problem, so it just created problems that I wouldn't have otherwise had. My researcher, her name was Tatiana Gleiser, fabulous woman, really came through. Well, I think there's Moscow mules to enjoy still, so I hope you will, and thank you so much for having me.